Hello. You're listening to the second episode for July 2023 of the BV podcast, your taste of rural and some urban Dorset life. A warm welcome from me, Jenny Devitt.
And me, Terry Bennett. Simon Hoare MP for North Dorset defends the government's record on handling the rapidly evolving effects of climate change and points to what he regards as an emerging public health crisis in the shape of vaping.
And questions, says the North Dorset LibDems' Mike Chapman in a mock exam paper, a political one, of course.
Labour's Pat Osborne welcomes the recent report into racism and other forms of discrimination in cricket and sees it as encouraging in making the sport a more inclusive environment for all.
And Ken Huggins of the North Dorset Green Party does find a bright spot among the gloom. Julie Hatcher of the Dorset Wildlife Trust talks about the appeal the Trust has recently launched to raise awareness and do something about the plastic pollution off Dorset's coasts. And Fanny Charles talks about the life and work of Dorset-based artist Philip Sutton.
Politics, changing climate and harmless fruit juice. Climate change is all around us and it is being acted on, while vaping could be the next public health crisis, says MP Simon Hoare. I want to cover two issues this month. The first is around the environment and the second on a public health matter. We've gone through an incredibly dry winter here in North Dorset, punctuated by just 2 heavy episodes of rain. From looking parched and somewhat Augusty after the latest deluge, the verges, gardens and fields are now looking a little fresher. Whichever way you look at it, our climate and therefore the environment is changing. It's no longer something anyone can tuck away in the too difficult drawer. I take the issue of climate change seriously and am proud of the record of the government since 2010 in driving forward the green renewables agenda. We saw strong leadership provided at COP in Glasgow, have overseen a massive expansion of offshore wind and solar power generation, a focus on electric vehicles, and the greening of the wider economy. There's been a significant tilt in the daily percentage of power generated in the UK from renewable sources, and a realisation that maximising domestic renewable energy security is as important as defence or food security. The groundbreaking Environment Act points the way to a more nature-rich, biodiverse and secure natural environment. We often forget that it was this government, the first among developed economy nations, that legislated for net zero by 2050. We are, of course, in a period of transition right now. Climate change sceptics point to the increasing costs to support renewable investments, and they're correct. But how much higher the cost of a degraded and destroyed world, rendered unfit by man's own hand for man's habitation? I didn't come into politics to witness a cultish global suicide pact. Those who are fully committed to addressing climate change worry that progress is not being made quick enough, that all use of non-renewable power sources should stop now. Of course, the goal is desirable and attainable, but we do have to keep the lights on, manufacturers manufacturing, etc., while we progress to that destination. Where things can be speeded up, I will continue to press, but confidence in the commitment of the government to achieve progress cannot be in serious question. The second issue I want to touch on is teenage health. Safe sex, don't smoke, healthy diets, exercise, sensible alcohol consumption, no drugs. They're all part of the parent and carer's mantra. It's only in recent weeks that media coverage and political narrative has turned to vaping. Somehow, plumes of dubiously sweet-flavoured smoke can be inhaled and exhaled with impunity. It's a flammable fruit juice, isn't it? Perfectly safe, isn't it? Entirely harmless? Well, I would urge parents, and in fact all those who are using vapes as the it's not a cigarette option, to take a look online, see some of the chemicals that go into vapes. Then ask a very simple question. If that was in food, would I buy it? Let my child eat it. Government is alert to the issue and the Prime Minister is taking a lead. Locally, I am particularly concerned, I declare an interest here, from September my 3 children will be attending school in the town, to see 2 vape shops in Gillingham, one adjacent to a sweet and party shop. 2 vape shops within striking distance of a very large high school. A coincidence or a deliberate marketing decision? You can probably guess what I think. I do not want, and neither does the government, to see vaping and its potentially addictive and adverse health effects become the next public health challenge.
And this month's contribution from Mike Chapman of the North Dorset LibDems. Questions, questions, questions. 'Tis the season of exams. I was cheered recently when an invigilator described the efforts that go into providing a level playing field for all those sitting exams, whatever their disadvantages or disability, from different colours of paper to C-pen readers, scribes and interpreters. Nothing, though, to suggest that a student should do anything other than bring their A-game and give the thing their best shot. With that questioning spirit in mind, here is a short quiz with some suggested answers. Question: what do the Conservative government and the recent Glastonbury Festival have in common? Answer: a rather tired lineup, giving us a few last hurrahs and a few notable early departures. Question: what do government, local and national, and English cricket both need to do? Answer: embrace a broader, more inclusive and representative approach. Stop ministering to a like-minded, narrow-minded and class-conscious minority. Throw the doors open to talent, energy, commitment and fair-mindedness. Question, many and various: where is the credible plan for a net zero? For a UK response to huge US and EU investment in the technologies of the future? For an effective, balanced strategy for NHS and public sector manpower, pay and conditions, for training and deploying the thousands of GPs we so sorely need, for beating down core inflation, for preventing profiteering by retailers, banks and energy providers, for protecting our environment from self-serving utility companies, for building the houses and communities we need, for enhancing our food security, for providing reliable, affordable public transport, for resolving the mess that is our economic relationship with Europe. I could go on. Multiple choice section. Is our army A, the strongest it has ever been, B, getting stronger by the year, or C, the smallest and weakest for 200 years? Is the NHS A, going from strength to strength, B, brilliant by international comparison, or C, worryingly fragile and open to fragmentation and sell-off? Is Brexit A, a success, B, still the right thing to have done, or C, both feet well and truly shot to pieces? The by-elections on the 20th of July give people across the country the opportunity to put this government on notice. This was written before the recent by-elections. A stronger message must follow. Not simply must do better, but that there is no confidence and even less trust in the Conservative ethos of personal freedom, aka look after number one and let the devil take the hindmost. Theirs has been an historic failure that now needs fixing by the grown-ups on behalf of all of us and our kids and grandkids. This government is now visibly hunkering down, eking out its last months in power, and focusing on the few dog-whistle topics that make the headlines in their safe papers. That isn't government. It is having us on.
Racist, sexist, elitist cricket? Not in my town, writes Labour's Pat Osborne. English cricket has been in the news for all the wrong reasons again this week, with a report from the Independent Commission for Equity in Cricket finding widespread and deep-rooted racism, sexism, elitism and class-based discrimination at all levels of the game. As an active member of my local branch of Unite, the union, an organisation that exists to protect and further the interests of working people in our communities, regardless of their race, gender or any other protected characteristic, the findings were simultaneously unsurprising and surprising. Unsurprising because the attitudes and behaviours described in the report are too often reflected in workplaces and in wider society. Surprising because, as proud sponsors of the Blandford girls' cricket for the past 3 seasons, our branch's own experience of community cricket could not be more different. The report is encouraging not just because it shows a commitment from the cricket community to root out racism, sexism and homophobia, but because it also seeks to address class-based discrimination, a form of discrimination that's rarely even acknowledged as existing. Encouraging too are examples from clubs like Blandford, which are clearly well on the way to getting it right. It's taken effort, will, time and support, but Blandford's commitment to diversity and inclusion is now self-evident, not only from the way that its membership reflects the full range of backgrounds of the people of Blandford and surrounding communities, but also from the concerted effort made by the club to champion inclusion in cricket for underrepresented groups such as women, girls and people with disabilities. And while Blandford Cricket Club continues to create such a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere, I'm certain that our branch and other local businesses and organisations will want to continue to sponsor their mission to bring people together through cricket.
Just recently, the Dorset Wildlife Trust launched an appeal to fight plastic pollution off the county's coast. Julie Hatcher is the Trust's Marine Awareness Officer. I spoke to her about the aims of the appeal and how much money they hope to raise.
With this marine appeal, Save Our Wild Seas, we're hoping to raise an extra £25,000 to fund our work.
And what will that go towards then, Julie?
Well, it'll go towards our engagement work, so we're trying to raise awareness of the various problems that are linked to marine litter. So through our visitor centres, making displays, talking to visitors, training our volunteers, that kind of thing. But also actually getting out and doing some practical work with volunteers and with members of the public. So we run public events where we go on the beach and we look at particularly at microplastics, for example.
And you collect them. So there's...
And we collect them, and then we use those to raise further awareness. And then we're sort of trialling a project with the public at the moment that we need funding to take forward, and that's looking at the issue of fishing net cuttings, which you might not hear a lot about in the press, but actually fishing net cuttings make up over 25% of all the beach litter found in the northwest Atlantic area, and certainly here along the Dorset coast we get an awful lot of little tiny pieces of fishing net. Sometimes they're called fisherman's kisses because you get the little cross, which is the corner of the squares of the fishing net that are cut out. And what fishermen do to repair their nets, obviously they do need repairing, and they tend to do it either at sea on their boat or on the quayside, and they cut sections of net out and replace them.
And just sling the cut out
bits they're not collected up, they're just left, and so they sort of, the weather, the tides, whatever, washes them into the sea. Or the wind blows them into the sea from the quayside. So they enter the marine environment, and this is happening, of course, not just here in Dorset, but all over the Atlantic. And of course, we get litter here from right across the Atlantic, from North America. We get fishing litter washing up that's only it's not used in this country, so we know it's not local.
And these little pieces of cut out bits of plastic netting, roughly how big are they?
Well, they can be any size, from massive pieces of net
in which marine animals can get caught, can't they?
Can get entangled, yeah, to tiny little 1 centimetre lengths of net. So they can be really tiny. And
those at that size, they could be mistaken for bits of food and fed to the young of, say, seabirds, couldn't they?
Absolutely, yes, they could be. And also they fray, so little bits of fibres all come out of them over time, which are sometimes microscopic. You can't even see them with the naked eye, so you can't remove them from the environment, and they get into animals. They've even been found in the gills of crabs, for example, and things like that. So they're so tiny. So getting all this stuff off the beach is really important. But not only that, it's trying to find a way of recycling it into something useful. So rather than sending all this beach litter to landfill, actually making it into something useful and preventing the use of further virgin plastic being made. That's the sort of thing we want to do.
And of course, Julie, just sending it back to landfill, were that to happen, in the case of microplastics, they would eventually find their way back into the seas through, the natural progression of being washed down with rain and then into the watercourses and then out to sea again, wouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, plenty of the plastic pollution is, of course, very visible, but you've just been talking about these microplastics, and there are billions of tiny culprits, aren't there, that you have to look pretty hard to spot, like plastic nurdles, those little blue things that get buried deep in a sandy beach, for instance.
Nurdles are the pre-production pellets used by the plastics industry, and that's how plastic is transported around the world to factories to be made into plastic products. And it might be the result of recycling plastic. So when you put your recycling in your recycling bin, ultimately that will be made into pellets to then be transported and used again. Or it might be virgin plastic, new plastic. So obviously they get spilled, and they're a bit like grains of rice, they flow. So if there's a spillage, they flow into the environment. It might be a container load of them that falls off a shipping container at sea, or they might get spilled in the factory and get washed down drains and end up in the sea. So there's lots of ways they can enter the marine environment, and they come in a multitude of colours actually. The blue ones that you mention could possibly be bio beads, which look very similar to nurdles, little pellets, but they're used in water treatment, so in sewage works, for example, and they also manage to get into the environment as well. So there's lots, like you say, there's lots of different forms of microplastic.
Now, I understand, Julie, that the sea off the Dorset coast alone has some 157 marine species of what you say conservation concern. How do you define conservation concern?
Well, conservation concern, it's like, with birds, there's a red list. Some of them are red listed because they've been under massive decline. And they're thought to be at risk of local extinction here in the UK. So they'll be red listed. So there's a way. It's not something that the wildlife trusts decide. It's something that the conservation authorities such as DEFRA Natural England, I should imagine, they decide which animals or species, I should say, are of conservation concern. It might be that they are what we call a keystone species, which if we lose them or if they go under decline, that's going to mean a big change for lots of other species that depend on them being there as part of the ecosystem. So there's various reasons why a species might be of conservation concern.
And of course, if those 157 marine species decline further, then of course that has implications for the richness and health of our coastal waters, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and even one species lost from an ecosystem can have, a knock-on effect on all the other species, because it might be the prey of a species that then affects the predator that's relying on it, or it might be a predator that is important for keeping the balance of species in the ecosystem. And we can't imagine what the consequences will be when we lose a species. So to lose 157 of them would be,
And what sort of species are these?
I would imagine, you've probably heard of seagrass, eelgrass. There's a couple of species in Dorset, and they form a very important habitat for lots and lots of animals that use them to breed, or as a nursery area for their young to grow up in a safe environment. Things that live in the seagrass meadow are seahorses, cuttlefish, quite a few juvenile commercial fish species such as bass and mullet and plaice. And they spend part of their life when they're young and vulnerable in those habitats because they're very rich in food for them, and also they provide shelter, so they're sheltered from bigger predators. So if we were to lose the seagrass, that would have a massive knock-on effect on other wildlife in that particular habitat.
And of
just
course,
as an example.
And of course that would mean a reduction in fish species, and therefore in the fish catch, and therefore in how much not cod and chips ends up on our plate, because we're not talking about cod down here, are we?
No, that's not to say there isn't any, but they're not here in numbers, no.
Now, Julie, Lyme Bay pretty much encompasses most of Dorset's coastline, doesn't it? So what's special about it?
Well, Lyme Bay is it's an area where it's a huge area, and it's been found to be a nursery area for some large animals like white-beaked dolphins and other dolphin species, and it's an important area for seabirds because of the currents that come in from the Atlantic.
So the natural or the marine environment of Poole Harbour is unique. Is that right?
Well, Poole Harbour's the second biggest natural harbour in the world, isn't it? And of course, it's a strange place because on the northern half of it is very urbanised, and the southern half is very wild, and so you have this unusual kind of habitat that's kind of half wild and half urbanised. So, and it's very heavily used, but it's also got a lot of wildlife in it. So I suppose in that sense, yes, it's unique. Very important for the bird populations, both in the summer and in the winter.
Now, all marine species presumably are adversely affected by plastic pollution. Which would you say, from your knowledge of the Dorset coastline, which are the ones most affected locally?
Well, I would say seabirds, because seabirds feed... if we're talking about microplastics, so it depends what type of litter we're talking about, but for microplastics, the nurdles, for example, while they're floating in the sea, they actually act like a magnet for chemicals, toxins that are at very dilute proportions in the sea, but because they're attracted to the nurdles, they become concentrated on them. So anything eating them, and seabirds in particular, because they feed at the surface of the sea, and they have done for millions of years, and why, they don't know not to now. They don't understand that in the last few decades the majority of the stuff floating at the sea has become plastic and inedible, so they feed on them. They
mistake them for food.
They mistake them for food. They're eating those chemicals that have been concentrated on the surface of the plastic, which is bad for them, and also they're feeding them to their chicks, so the chick gets a stomach full of plastic, feels full, so stops asking for food, and can ultimately starve to death. So seabirds in particular are very vulnerable. But if you're talking about big pieces of net and rope and that kind of thing that can form a raft in the sea, then it's larger animals like seals, but also seabirds again that can get entangled in that, and then they just get exhausted. Quite often they can get snagged with this rope underwater and drown. So those are the animals I would think are most at risk here in Dorset.
We tend to think, don't we, Julie, I suppose, that most plastic comes into the sea or enters the sea from the shore. But something like 22%, I understand, according to research, comes from shipping.
Yes, I mean shipping, and obviously we get a lot of fishing litter, as I was saying. Over 25%, I believe it's 28% of beach litter is derived from fishing net cuttings and fishing nets. Shipping, yeah, I know there are very tight controls internationally on what ships can dump at sea, but of course when you're out at sea there's no one to see what you're doing. So I'm sure that, you know, there are ships that are unscrupulous and dump their rubbish rather than pay to have it disposed of when they're in port.
I suppose, Julie, it's easy to think that plastic pollution of the seas and Dorset's coast in particular is something that doesn't affect us as individuals, or does it?
That's a hard one, isn't it? Obviously, if you're visiting the beach and you live near the beach or you holiday by the coast, then visually you can, you know, you have to put up with that, and it's not very aesthetically pleasing to go to a lovely, you know, a beautiful place by the coast and find it covered in litter. And it's having this effect on the wildlife that we see, and all the litter that's out in the ocean drifting around is also bringing, there are animals obviously that use it as an attachment, oceanic animals. So animals that aren't normally found here, not native to the UK, can arrive here en masse attached to litter, and that is happening. And then that can have a devastating impact on our native wildlife.
Not good news, that at all. But talking of news, is there any good news, Julie, regarding plastic pollution along Dorset's coast?
Well, there is actually, because a few years ago, the issue of marine litter was brought to the general public's attention and highlighted on primetime television, and it's something called the David Attenborough effect. It mobilised masses of people to actually take action against litter, to get out and pick this litter up from the beaches. And what I've noticed personally is that you don't get the masses of litter that used to collect and accumulate on our beaches in Dorset. The plastic bottles, the bundles of balloons with their strings all entangled, plastic carrier bags, because when this litter does wash up, that's not to say it's not there, but when it does wash up, people pick it up almost as soon as it touches land. So there are community groups that go out regularly keeping their local beaches clean. There are individuals that go out every time they go to the beach and just pick up a few items of litter to remove. And of course, with lots of people doing that, it has a big impact. And certainly here at Kimmeridge, where I am, you don't get the big accumulations of litter anymore that you used to. But in their place, of course, there is a rising volume of microplastic, which is a whole different kettle of fish. It's not easy for people to pick up. So that needs a different solution. And of course, the solution to all of it is to put less of it in, to produce less waste, to get rid of single-use plastics altogether if we can. And I think people are doing that. They're using refillable bottles when they go out for a day trip. They're, using reusable shopping bags now rather than those very flimsy single-use plastic carrier bags that we all used to have. So I am noticing a difference, but it's not the end of the problem. There is more that we can do.
Julie Hatcher, Marine Awareness Officer for the Dorset Wildlife Trust. And if you'd like to donate to this appeal, then go on the Dorset Wildlife Trust website. Artist Philip Sutton is nearly 95. He lives, and he's still painting, near Bridport. We like to put artists in different boxes, but he doesn't regard himself as fitting into any one particular art movement. Nevertheless, he's known as a colourist. In fact, he's considered one of the leading exponents of that art form in this country. His paintings are indeed wonderfully colourful, mostly landscapes and flowers. Philip Sutton has his own gallery in Bridport, but has exhibited his work several times at West Bay's Slader's Yard Gallery, including just recently. Author and journalist Fanny Charles, who's best known locally as the editor for over 20 years of the original Blackmore Vale magazine, met Philip Sutton and told me something of his life and work.
When you look at Philip's paintings, what you get is wonderful colour and joy, even quite dark subjects like sort of dramatic coastlines, they still have extraordinary depth of colour. He's a painter who, I think words like freedom come to mind when you look at Philip's paintings, because his use of colour is so natural and joyful.
And has he always been like that, do you think?
Yes.
I mean, would this date from sort of teenage years or from when he first started painting?
Well, yes. I'll tell you the story he told me. He's going to be 95 in October. And so he's just had a big retrospective at Slader's Yard at West Bay, which is how I came to interview him. When he was a very young boy, he was born in Poole, has no recollection of Bournemouth, Poole, Dorset at all as a child, because almost immediately went to London. Sees himself as an East Ender.
Not as a Dorset man at all.
Not as
even though he migrated back here.
Yes. Dorset born, back in Dorset, but he sees himself as an East Ender. And his brother, who was a few years older than him, went to work for a printer's in Holborn. His brother died on active service in 1942, and Philip, at the age of 14, left school and went to work, and he went to work at the same printers in Holborn. He says he thinks they gave him the job out of sympathy. Whatever, he worked there. And after the war, he did national service. He was on the Berlin airlift, which is an extraordinary experience to have had. And then he went to the Slade School, which is where the colour comes in. Because when his brother was working at the printers, his brother had a whole set of amazing coloured inks, because printers used coloured inks. When he got to the Slade School, apart from a hilarious description of going into this room where they were going to be having their first sort of practical session, and it being full of what he described as naked ladies covered in dust, these were sculptures of Greek goddesses. So his mother gave him his brother's set of inks. Red, blue, yellow, vivid colours. All the others had HB pencils. And I think it almost it tells you a lot about him that he stuck with his coloured inks while the rest were doing their lovely drawings in black and white.
What did the tutor think of that then?
And so that he
must have been a bit surprised.
He recalls a little while, not days, weeks or even months, when the tutor was called Sam, and he said, "Phil, I don't think I can help you," and Philip said to Sam, "I don't think you can." He always knew what he wanted to do. And so I think the great thing about him is to meet somebody who has lived through so many art trends and fads and fashions, op art, pop art, you name it, of course, conceptual art, and not to mention the YBAs, the Young British Artists. Philip has never been touched by any of these fads or fashions. He's done his own thing.
He's never agreed or considered that he could be put in a box and labelled with any particular movement.
No. He's never wanted to belong to one. It wouldn't suit him. He is one of them. He's not a rebel. That's the interesting thing. You don't feel that he was ever somebody who was aggressively pursuing a different way of working. It's how he works. It's how he expresses himself. I mean, he said all sorts of fascinating things to me, and I could read you a couple of the quotes explaining, what he says about how he approaches work. But one of the most interesting stories he did talk to me about, because I already knew he was very interested in prehistory and in prehistoric art, and he's not alone in that. I mean, there's Brian Graham down in Swanage, who's an artist who works very closely with archaeologists and paleontologists. but he's an abstract artist, and Philip is not abstract. After the Slade, and he did very well at the Slade, and he won prizes, and then he got a bursary to travel, and he'd married Heather by then, and Heather, they met at the Slade, and Heather is sadly now dead, but she was a pioneering woman documentary maker, and he and Heather went off and travelled through mainly France. They did go into Spain as well, but they spent this year with this scholarship exploring, and one of the things they did was go to see the cave paintings of Lascaux, and this is before they were closed, because of course the number of people who went to see them, all the hot air that people were blowing out was beginning to damage these incredibly
the condensation
fragile,
from people's breath.
So I'm sure you know this, but what they did was they created a copy of the Lascaux paintings in another cave, but where people could go. So they could go and see the exact replicas, but Philip and Heather actually saw the originals.
They were very lucky, because it was in the early 60s that the caves were actually closed to the public.
Yes, so this was in the early-ish 50s.
And did that, I mean, they are very striking, those, what are they, 20, 40,000 years old, those paintings?
Well, he was telling me that they're now saying it may be 40,000.
40,000. And did that have what was it about them that had this strong influence on him?
I think it was, I hate to put words in his mouth, I think it was the sense that they painted what they saw, what they knew. I mean, leave aside the sheer mind-blowing idea. Have you been into any of these caves and seen them? Okay, so have we. We've seen originals, because there are other places not so well known where they do still let you go in. And the first thing that you're struck with, apart from the colours, which are amazing, and the life and movement in the paintings, the other thing that strikes you is they did this by, tallow candlelight? Unbelievable. I mean, what drives human beings to create is a huge topic, of course.
Another topic altogether.
But Philip found these inspiring, and he has gone on being fascinated by prehistoric art in all its forms. But I think also, and again, I'd hate to put any kind of words in his mouth, but I think indigenous art as well really fascinates him, because another thing he did a few years later, I think it was you and I think maybe old enough to remember the winter of 1963.
Yes, that I believe was my first winter in this country.
Ah, okay. So where did you
I thought Africa. I thought it did this every winter.
No, 1963 was pretty remarkable. Anyway, he decided he had by then he and Heather had 3 young children, and so he asked around, and he asked a friend, where they might go to spend the winter somewhere warmer, and the friend suggested Fiji. So they went, and in fact they travelled through Australia and other South Sea islands, and they settled, and they spent nearly a year on Fiji.
So he did a bit of a Gauguin, didn't he? Only Gauguin went to Tahiti and stayed there.
And he did have a wife and children, and he didn't. I'm trying not to use.
Say no more.
Yes, Gauguin and the island women. It's another story.
But Fiji he produced some wonderful, vibrant paintings from that, didn't he? So it clearly had a strong influence on him.
Yes. If you go on to his website, which is just Philip Sutton RA, and it's really worth going to look at, there's quite a lot of paintings there. But the other thing that's absolutely fascinating is that Heather made a documentary. It's black and white, and it just has a soundtrack. There's no voices, nothing. And you just see them going about their lives in Fiji. Well, first of all, nowadays, I suppose it's on various people's ghastly cruise ship routes and things. But in those days, it was not a place that many people visited. And obviously no tarmac roads, no tourist shops, nothing. Just, local people going about their lives, and a few local shops for their needs, but a very, very much more self-sufficient life than they probably have now with all the influx of people. And it's a lovely film, actually. You see him, you don't hear anything, you just see him, you see him talking to people, you see the children running around. just enjoying being in this incredibly beautiful place. And it's an extraordinary film. I mean, it's a fascinating bit of archive film of an artist working, but it's also fascinating seeing Fiji. What are we talking about? 60 years ago. Amazing.
Now, I understand that at some point before then, I think, he was sort of taken under the wing of Peter Pears and Benjamin Britten.
Yes, he lived in Suffolk for a while.
Fanny just taking some coffee, yes.
Sorry. In or near. Sorry.
It is coffee time.
in or near Aldborough. But they're after Fiji, they lived in London, Battersea, I think, and he worked on all sorts of projects. He did a lot of commissions. For somebody as independent-minded as him, he did do various commissions for big companies like Shell. He designed the logo for, I think it's the European Chamber Orchestra, and it's a bird, and they still use that logo. But probably the most interesting commission, certainly the most interesting to me, because I love theatre, love Shakespeare, love the Globe. Sam Wanamaker asked him to paint a series of paintings inspired by Shakespearean plays, wide open field for somebody whose background was not theatrical. But Sam wanted this. I mean, of course, the real tragedy of Sam Wanamaker is he died before the Globe opened. He knew it was going to happen, but he didn't live to see it. But it happened, and as he had wanted, Philip's exhibition of paintings of Shakespeare, about Shakespeare, work, things to do with Shakespeare, was the first exhibition at the Globe. And he didn't really know where to start, and he saw the Olivier film of Henry V, and something about that unlocked it for him. He researched costume and all sorts of aspects, and the paintings are wonderful, absolutely amazing. But it was so although he is a very independent-minded artist, and nobody has ever told him what to do, he also had a very successful career, commercially, if you like, doing all these commissions. But again, I think I'm guessing people asked him to do it because they loved his colour and the feeling of just vivacity
and
becomes
just
life.
Feeling of life and colour.
Absolutely.
But of course, a lot of he had in common with a lot of artists and craftspeople. They don't necessarily like working to commission, but it does make sure that some money comes in.
Yes, that's fairly important, particularly when you've got 4 young children. Yes, you do. So they carried on living in London, and then they moved to West Wales, to Pembrokeshire. Lived there for a very long time. He did a lot of wonderful painting there. And they moved to Dorset. I can't remember which year they moved to Dorset, but within the last 20 years. And they lived near Bridport. Heather sadly died. Philip now lives in a care home, and 2 of his daughters are in the area. There was one daughter already there, and Saskia has moved there more recently. So he's now got two of his daughters, and they're all very close. It was lovely meeting his daughters because they value what he does, and he's very relaxed and happy. The most remarkable thing about him is that talking to him, you do not for a moment see that this is a man in his mid-90s.
And furthermore, Fanny, he has, and this is extraordinary for an artist who is still painting at the age of 95, he only has sight in one eye now.
Yeah. Yes, and I don't think you'd notice it because his face is so bright. There's a photograph that we've got with the article on BV Magazine that was taken by Millie Pelkington, who's a great portrait photographer and lives in Dorset. And she took it as an article for The Guardian. We're very privileged to have been able to reproduce this photograph. But The Guardian did an article interviewing people in care homes of their experience of lockdown when they had such a very long time when the families couldn't see them. And this was his first time out, as it were, having tea with his daughters in the garden of one of their houses, and just this gorgeous picture. And he's wearing this yellow yachtsman's mac. You know, you picture yachtsmen, they always have these wonderful bright yellow macs on and a proper sailor's cap. And you look at him and he looks as rakish and bright as he probably did 40 years ago.
Wearing vibrant colours, just like his paintings.
Yes, vibrant colours.
I mean, it must have been for an artist like Philip Sutton to have been stuck in lockdown for, well, care homes were in lockdown for far longer than the rest of us. Must have been like being in prison, because here was a man who liked to go outside and paint landscapes,
yes,
and he couldn't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't talk to him very much about it because it struck me as being a period that probably he's happily moved on from. He's still painting. That's what's so wonderful. I mean, the exhibition at Slater's, which is now finished, I mean, it had a lot of paintings which members of the family loaned, which have never been exhibited before. But it was just so wonderful looking at these paintings, and although his style has changed, he still has that incredible freedom, which I suspect was where Sam, the Slade school tutor, saw this and realised, I'm guessing, I think he must have thought, I can't teach this young man anything. He knows how to paint. He knows what he wants to do with his art, and he has a sense of colour. And that's what he still does, and that's why he's called a colourist.
And finally, Fanny, I'm quite sure you would like to own one of his paintings, would you? You could put it on your office wall, the wall behind you. There's room there, is there?
Yes. I'd love to have one of his paintings. Sadly, can't afford one, but I'd love to have one.
And what would you like a painting of?
I'd like one of his wonderful, vivid paintings of flowers. I'm not, by nature, a still life or flower painting person. You know, I love the Flemish old masters, and I love the more you look into their paintings, the more bugs and little bits of things falling off that you see in them, because they're never perfect, because that was the whole kind of, you know, Lutheran take on life. Nothing in this world could ever be perfect. But Philip's paintings are so joyful, so full of colour. I'd love one.
So even on a nasty grey English winter's morning, you wake up, come and look at that, it would lift your heart.
Absolutely. It really would. Meeting him, and I've interviewed a lot of artists over the years, Philip is a joy.
Author and editor Fanny Charles talking to me about artist Philip Sutton. And that's all for the second episode of July's BV podcast. Terry and I will be back again in a few days with episode 3. So until then, it's bye-bye from me, Jenny Devitt.
And it's goodbye from me, Terry Bennett.